70-740 Lesson 11, Installing and Configuring the Windows Nano Server. Yes, there's another version of Windows Server that we haven't talked about. It's the Nano Server. It can be installed as a standard or data center just like our other versions, but the way it's installed is completely different, and the way that it's used is completely different. So let's talk about it. Nano Server, it's a new installation option for Windows Server 2016. It has a smaller hardware footprint than Server Core. It's got no local sign-in capability. It only supports 64-bit applications, tools, and agents. So it's different from Windows Server Core, whereas with Core we've got a interface that we can log into. It's got no local sign-in capability. So to use it, you have to create a virtual hard disk. You then use that virtual hard disk on a virtual machine to support a virtualized Nano server and Hyper-V. Alternatively, you can configure that VHD to be bootable so that you could start the Nano server on a physical computer, booting from the VHD. There's also another option to create a WIM file and install it using Windows PE. So there's a couple different ways to create it, but understand that it's a much more compact version. It's a smaller footprint. It's more restricted. So there are many scenarios where you could take advantage of it. If you want higher security, you want a smaller hardware footprint, maybe Nano Server would work for you. You could use it as a Hyper-V host computer. You could use it as a storage host for a scale-out file server. You could run DNS on it. We could run a web server on it. Or it could be a host computer that runs a container, and a container is something we're going to talk about in Lesson 12. Now, to install Nano Server, first off, we need a server running Windows Server 2016 and at least 800 megabytes of free disk space. Well, these days that shouldn't be a problem, right? Of course, you might need additional disk space to store data and have additional processor and memory for the load that the Nano server is going to be running. As we mentioned before, it can't be directly installed from your DVD or from your ISO. Instead, we have to create an installation media Nano server folder, and with that we generate a Nano server image. As I previously mentioned, there's 3 different ways that we can install it. We can create a VHD, or rather a VHDX, and it will be hosted as a virtual machine on a Hyper-V host. Also, we could create that same virtual hard disk as a bootable drive for a physical computer. Remember, you can boot a VHD on your physical computer. And then thirdly, as we spoke about, we could create a WIM file and use that along with WinPE to install Nano Server on a physical computer. So 1 virtualized option, and then 2 to where we take an installation on a physical computer. We create that Nano Server image that we're going to use for either of those 3 processes, and we do it in PowerShell. We use the new -nano server image commandlet. We also have to define what type of an edition, whether it's standard or data center, whether the deployment type is going to be a host, which would be for that WIM or bootable VHD, or guest as a guest virtual machine, VHD that's used for that. We define media path and target path and all these other things. And when we create that media, we actually install the packages that we want to have at that time. We can actually configure it so it already has the IIS package, so it could be a web server right out of the box. It could be a DNS server out of the box. Here are the four basic steps to create the image. There's a Nano image generator folder on our installation media, that ISO or DVD. We copy that to a folder on our computer. Then we run PowerShell and we import a PowerShell module. Using the commandlets in that PowerShell module, then we go ahead and we create our VHD or WIM file. Here are the steps for deploying the VHD as a virtual machine, and we'll do that in our lab, and then create that virtual machine and access it. Here are the steps to create that Nano server VHD image that's going to be used as a boot on a physical computer. And then finally, how to go about creating that Nano server WIM to install onto a physical computer. Now, how do you manage and configure it? Well, after you install and place that Nano server, you still need to do a little bit of configuration. You're going to configure the networking, the firewall, adding in the server to your domain, adding roles and features. Once that's done, you can then manage the server using Server Manager, PowerShell, and as well as some other management tools. Before you make significant changes to a Nano server that's running as a virtual machine, make sure you take a checkpoint, make sure you back it up. The disadvantage of that Nano server is that you can only perform a very small set of tasks on the running Nano server. All other tasks you're going to have to do remotely. With the Nano recovery tool, it's the local tool on that Nano server. It allows you to do a few items. It allows you to show the computer name, the username, the work group or your domain name, the operating system, the time, date and time. You can configure the networking. We can configure some inbound and outbound firewall rules. We can enable or disable WinRM. And then we can also view MAC address, enable or disable DHCP. And of course, since we're setting networking, we can configure an IPv4 address or an IPv6 address if we're not going to use DHCP. Once we've enabled WinRM, we can then do remote management to it using Windows PowerShell. And we do that using the enter--ps session. And we'll take a look at that in our lab. So when we do need to manage it, we need to do a thing called set item. And what we do is we add the IP address of that Nano server to our management computer, where we're going to manage it from, to a list of trusted hosts. That's how we are able to get access to it. So there's a lot of different things. Make sure you understand that. When we go to join it, it doesn't have the typical domain join interface. So we have to use a utility called djoin.exe. And what that does is it pre-provisions the computer and generates what's called an ADJ blob file. Then we configure our firewall, we copy that ODJ blob file and apply it to the Nano server. I know it sounds complicated. We'll do this in the lab, so at that point it should make a little bit more sense. But here are those steps to do that on our computer. In fact, on our domain controller, we run that djoin command and we give it all the different information. And then we run the set item. And then we set as a variable our IP address of the Nano server. We enter the PS session. We give it the password to get access. We can enable some firewall settings at that point. Once we've done that, we exit the PS session. We then are going to map a drive using the netuse command. At that point, once we've mapped a drive to the Nano server, now we can copy our file. We go back into a PS session, we switch, and then we use the djoin command to request the ODJ and load it. And at that point, we can reboot the computer, and it should be joined to our domain. Since we can view and manage it remotely with PowerShell, we can access it and get a listing of all the installed roles and features. We can update it. There's some steps to update it that it's pretty complicated. We're not going to do this in our lab, but understand that you can, rather than simply downloading and installing updates, which just doesn't have the capability of doing, you can visit what's called the Microsoft Update Catalog, and you can download cumulative updates. Once you've downloaded those .msu files, you can expand those cab files from the MSUs. Those cabs are what gets installed. And you put them in a separate directory, and then you copy those all into a single folder. And then you would follow the commands you see on your screen to be able to go ahead and copy them over. You're going to rebuild your image. You're going to build the image then with those cabs included. And then you can also apply those cumulative updates on a running Nano server using the edit-nano server image. You can see it there on the last line of text before our skill summary. So, as I said, this is a pretty brief lesson. It's almost as brief as Nano server is small. Understand that Nano server, it's a new installation option. It's got a smaller hardware footprint than Server Core. It's got no local signing capability. It only supports 64-bit applications, tools, and agents. To install it, you have to do it with a copy of Windows Server running, and in that we extract the files and create the installation media. It doesn't get installed from your DVD or an ISO. Once we install and place the Nano server, we need to configure it. And that includes configuring our networking, our firewall, enabling WinRM for remote management, adding the server to the domain, adding roles and features. And once that's done, then we can manage it using Server Manager. We can simply add the Nano server and its associated role to a service console from Server Manager on a different machine. The main tool that you're going to use to configure the Nano server is the Nano recovery tool. It's got the tools that'll let you establish connectivity to your remote management tools. It's a very brief lesson. The lab's going to be a little bit longer because it's a lot more steps to be able to do this. So we're going to take a look at that in our lab. Make sure you've read through the lesson thoroughly and you understand all the different sections of this. It's not long, but it's a different concept than what we've been looking at before. Thank you for reviewing 70-740 Lesson 11. See you in the next lesson or lab.